It's a pleasure to be here. I really had a great time walking around the campus last night. It's been a long time since I've been back, and Penn has changed, and yet Penn has stayed exactly the same. There were places that I remember going to, it must have been at least 10 years ago. And they're still there, and they still give me a little hitch in the mid-thoracic area when I think about them. So my talk today is about making guidelines work. I'm going to talk a little bit about a process of knowledge formalization that we've been working with Bob and others on, and show you a clinical decision support tool that we use for asthma. But at least a good portion of this discussion is going to talk about making guidelines that work. You can't have guidelines working unless you have workable guidelines. So I'm going to talk a bit about the process of making good guidelines. What are they for? What are the current shortcomings? And I'm going to mention a tool we've developed called BRIDGE-Wiz that's intended for guideline developers to help them make better guidelines. I'm going to describe, as I say, several software applications. They're developed in our laboratory. So you don't worry about it. They're all free. I'm not going to make money by talking about these today. And I receive funding from ARC. I have a terrific collaboration with CHOP investigators, and I just wish it was going to go on longer. The GLIDES project, which is this funded opportunity from ARC, includes a number of wonderful folks. In addition to my friends at Yale, we've had input from folks at Nemours, CHOP and Geisinger, who are all, and Alliance of Chicago, who all do guideline implementation. We've had terrific input from ECRI, who are responsible for the National Guidelines Clearinghouse, and then a number of professional societies, each of which is in the business of developing guidelines among other businesses. So what are guidelines for? Going back now 20-some years, guidelines really came into their own in the late 80s, early 90s, when Wenberg and his friends at Dartmouth noted that there was excessive practice variation for some procedures. You can see on this scatter plot that for some procedures there's really very little difference in the rate at which it occurs. But for others, the three on the right, back surgery, radical prostatectomy, peripheral angioplasty, there's a 7-fold difference from one HRH, what is that? HRR, hospital-related region or something like that. There's tremendous variation, and that tremendous variation has to include some undertreatment, perhaps by some of those dots, some overtreatment by some of the other dots, and wrong treatment by even others of those dots. It's hoped that guidelines can make a difference in those activities. I guess it's now a year ago, Clinical Practice Guidelines We Can Trust is a publication that came out of the Institute of Medicine. It's given us a whole new context for thinking about what makes good guidelines, and I had the privilege of serving on this panel. That panel recognized a number of shortcomings in the knowledge source that we use for our clinical decision support systems. That the development process is often not transparent. There are conflicts of interest and developer teams that are insufficiently multidisciplinary or balanced, all leading to the potential for bias. Existing knowledge is not being systematically reviewed by all guideline developers. The evidence foundations and the strength of recommendations are not explicitly recorded quite often. Articulation of recommendations is simply not clear. Reviewer input isn't broad-based, and new knowledge isn't being incorporated. That's a lot of problems. And the IOM has some suggested standards for dealing with these. I'm going to concentrate on numbers 5 and 6, and I'm going to do it in reverse order, because those are the ones that are of most interest, I think, to guideline implementers as opposed to developers. The IOM said that recommendations should be articulated in a standardized form, detailing precisely what the recommended action is and under what circumstances it should be performed. And strong recommendations ought to be worded so that you could measure compliance with them, because those are the ones you really care about measuring compliance. We've been saying for quite some time now that if guideline authors used a format like is shown here, things would be a whole lot better for us. If they recorded when, that is, under what circumstances, who in the intended audience ought, with what level of obligation, to do precisely what, to whom, and then describe how and why, our guidelines would be much more easy to adhere to. And our friends in informatics would be able to turn them into if-then statements. Our friends in performance management measurement would be able to turn it into denominators and numerators. Here's a guideline from our British friends who are so good at using the language. For people with type 2 diabetes, the use of a glitazone as second-line therapy, added to either metformin or a sulfonylurea as an alternative to treatment with a combination of metformin and a sulfonylurea, is not recommended except for those who are unable to take metformin and a sulfonylurea in combination because of it's a mess. There are enough double, triple, quadruple negatives there that I've wrestled with this a long time. However, if you restate it as if a patient is unable to take the combination of metformin and a sulfonylurea because of intolerance or contraindication, then the clinician should prescribe a glitazone to replace the drug that's not tolerated. All that takes is putting these things together into that format I showed you first. There's the whole issue of ambiguous, vague, and underspecified language. It's very popular to be used in guideline recommendations. Frankly, ambiguous statements are really quite rare. These are things that you can actually interpret in more than one way at the same time. You wind up running into these statements when you mix ands and ors in the same statement, because A and B or C is not the same as A and B or C. You also run into this sometimes when people use abbreviations, because people interpret the same abbreviation in different ways. However, much more common than frank ambiguity is vagueness and underspecification. Vague concepts lack a crisp threshold in a single dimension. Does this neonate have a fever if his temperature is 100 degrees? Does this count as short stature or excessive weight? Or you can be truly underspecified when you lack specificity in multiple dimensions, sufficiently ill to warrant immediate antimicrobial therapy. Lots of ways to interpret that statement. I'm going to skip that. Verbs are particularly important to guideline authors because guidelines tell you what to do, and in fact that's what makes guidelines different from systematic reviews. They tell you what to do. We need to concentrate on verbs and make sure they're clear. Our beloved Attorney General, former Attorney General, admitted that mistakes were made in the firing of states where they regional attorneys general when the Bush White House cleared out politically disagreeing attorneys general. Mistakes were made, but we have no idea who made those mistakes. So passive voice is something to be avoided when you write guideline recommendations. In fact, transitive verbs are a good thing to use because the transitive verbs act upon an object, and usually you can measure and understand exactly what that action is supposed to be. Another important aspect of verb use is figuring out what the appropriate level of intended obligation is. So one of our fellows several years ago did this study. How should we write guideline recommendations? How do we interpret deontic terminology? His goal was to describe the level of obligation that was conveyed by a number of obligation terms: must, should, may. Can the level of obligation be understood and be standardized, he wondered. So he did a web-based survey of 1,300 registrants at the AHRQ annual meeting. He presented them with questions like, if the patient has condition X, clinicians must prescribe drug A. Clinicians must consider prescribing drug A. Clinicians should just prescribe drug A. And he asked people to move a bar back and forth on a scale from no obligation to full obligation to indicate what they perceive to be the level of obligation intended by each of these terms. And what he found was that it's possible to rank a whole bunch of these terms in descending order, but there's an amazing amount of overlap in their interquartile ranges. In fact, he was able to find 3 terms that didn't overlap: must, should, and may. And perhaps we should be thinking of using those terms to convey non-overlapping senses of what we perceive the level of obligation associated with the recommendation to be. Now, statements of facts are not recommendations, and yet we often see statements like adjuvant hormone therapy for locally advanced breast cancer results in improved survival in the long term. Recommendation 3. Unfortunately, this statement, while true, doesn't tell you what to do. Clinicians should prescribe adjuvant hormone therapy for locally advanced breast cancer when or unless. That's a do statement, and that's what we should be doing. And then we come to the dreaded consider. The expert panel concludes that initiating daily long-term control therapy should be considered. Referral may be considered. There are all kinds of things we can consider. But the problem is you can't measure when something was considered. We don't have a way to know that something was considered. We only can record what was done. And Peter Drucker has said, the management guru, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And importantly, if you don't measure it, you can't improve it. Those consider recommendations make it very difficult to measure and improve. Another one of our fellows, some years back, looked at the kinds of actions, the kinds of verbs that guidelines tell us to do. And amazingly enough, there are only 13 or 14 things that guidelines ask us to do. They ask us to test, to inquire, to monitor our patients over time, or to examine them in a particular way, to come to some conclusion, perhaps about a diagnosis or prognosis, or to prescribe, perform a procedure, educate or counsel our patients, consult or refer, document in the record, prevent, advocate on our patient's behalf, prepare our facility in some way, or dispose of our patient, most often by admission, discharge, or transfer. Why do I tell you this? You'll see in just a few moments. But I want to turn to the other IOM standard, establishing evidence foundations and rating the strength of it recommendations. The IOM said that for each recommendation should be provided a summary of the relevant available evidence, a description of the quality, quantity, and consistency of the aggregate available evidence that supports that recommendation, and a clear description of potential benefits and harms that might be anticipated if that recommendation is followed, and an explanation of potential benefits and an explanation of the part played by values, opinion, theory, and clinical experience in deriving that recommendation, and a description of any differences of opinion that were left with the development team regarding the recommendation, and a rating of the level of confidence in the evidence that supported that recommendation, and a rating of the strength of the recommendation. Now, granted, this is somewhat aspirational, but it is possible, and I'm going to show you a tool that we've developed in just a few moments that helps to get all this information together. Bridging the gap between authors and implementers, this software tool called BRIDGE-Wiz for building recommendations in a developer's guideline editor was designed to address exactly the considerations you saw on the previous slide. This is a typical setup for a guideline development group, sitting around a table with a projector, and we ask that on that projector you show the BRIDGE-Wiz program. You start off with a general idea, like kids with newly diagnosed type 2 diabetes should get started on metformin as first-line treatment along with diet and exercise, and we turn that into a recommendation. The first screen in BRIDGE-Wiz gives you a lovely welcome, and we push the button to create a key action statement where we ask for a verb, about the verb. We ask, what kind of activity are you proposing? And this gets back to the action type that I showed you, the 13 varieties of actions that are called for. So you can choose, and remember this is about starting metformin, so that's a prescribe activity. Based on that prescribe action type, we have a number of approved verbs, transitive verbs that are applicable and have been used for prescribing in the past, and here's the drop down. In fact, starting is one of the verbs that seems to work pretty well, so we'll select that. And now we ask the question, start what? Importantly, we started this not thinking about under what circumstances. We started this thinking about what are we going to tell people to do. We're going to tell them to start what? Start metformin as first-line treatment. And you'll recall that it wasn't just starting metformin, but we're also going to counsel our patients using the verb recommend. We're going to recommend diet and exercise. So this is the then side of an if-then recommendation statement. The next step is to check its executability, asking the team convened in front of that screen, is each of the recommended actions stated specifically and unambiguously so that members of the intended audience would execute each of these actions in a consistent way. Start metformin as first-line treatment, everybody agreed, that's pretty clear. Recommend diet and exercise, that's a little vague. So this team made the judgment that it was too difficult to explain in the bold-faced statement exactly what they meant by recommending diet and exercise, but they planned to go into great detail in the amplifying text that would accompany the bold-faced statement. The next step is to add the conditions. Under what conditions will starting metformin as first-line treatment recommending diet and exercise be performed? And here we type in, if you're newly diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, that's the sole condition under which this will be performed. We next shift to evaluation and asking the team, would the guidelines' intended audience consistently determine whether each condition has been satisfied? Well, newly diagnosed, they agreed, was a little on the vague side, so they needed to define it. And they added a parenthetic clause. You are newly diagnosed if you have not been previously treated with for your diabetes. The next step is to describe the benefits of this first action, the benefits of starting metformin if you're newly diagnosed. And here's where the team kind of energizes and starts calling out true benefits. You'll lower hemoglobin A1C, the target A1C sustained longer, improved insulin sensitivity, etc. And next we ask, what are the anticipated risks, harms, and sometimes costs of starting metformin? Well, there are certainly GI side effects. There's this uncommon potential for lactic acidosis and B12 deficiency, etc. The team is next asked to make a judgment. Do those benefits outweigh the harms, or vice versa, or are they in equilibrium? And this group judged that there was a preponderance of benefit, even though there may have been more numerically harms. Their importance was less than the aggregate benefit that was to be appreciated. So they judged that there was a preponderance of benefit. And next, we asked them to select the aggregate evidence quality that supports these benefits, risks, harms. And looking at the system that is used at this organization, they decided that really the best they had were observational studies. They did not have trial valued evidence in these circumstances, so they clicked C. And we'll skip that. And the next question is, who ought to be doing this? Who's supposed to be starting metformin? It's not Alberto Gonzalez this time. Who's in charge? And the general term was clinicians. The next activity is to repeat this for the "and" clause. We need to go back over recommending diet and exercise because the benefits and harms and the balance and the evidence quality and the deontic terminology are likely to be somewhat different. And after you've gone through all that, BRIDGE-Wiz offers you 4 styles, 4 ways of saying the same information. If you're newly diagnosed, that is not previously treated, then clinicians should start metformin as first-line treatment with evidence quality moderate, recommendation strength weak, and clinicians should recommend diet and exercise with evidence quality moderate, recommendation strength weak, or 3 other ways that say exactly the same thing. The output from BRIDGE-Wiz is a summary of all of this. It's the key action statement, the if-then statement, the aggregate evidence quality, a listing of the benefits, risks, harms, and costs, and a benefit harms assessment that were made. There's also a place in this Microsoft Word document to record what value judgments might have been applied, what's the role of patient preference, was there intentional vagueness introduced because perhaps there was residual conflict in the team or insufficient evidence, but they felt a need that they wanted to make a recommendation anyway. So BRIDGE-Wiz formalizes a process for writing implementable recommendations. It focuses the discussion when people try to get off track and start pontificating. I hate to use that term, but sometimes this happened. It offers controlled natural language, verb choices that are based on action type. It traps and disallows use of the term consider. It discourages statement of fact that don't have a true action. It limits Boolean connectors to all ands or all ors. It suggests an appropriate obligation term. It incorporates decidability and executability checks and requires a systematic appraisal of evidence quality and benefits and harms. This is what the first, 5 user groups thought of their experience in using BRIDGE-Wiz. I know it's impossible to read, but each of the statements on the left is a positive statement about BRIDGE-Wiz in some way, and the level of agreement is indicated by the color. Being green is good, very green is very good, yellow is neutral, red is disagreeing. But these statements, which were all designed to be positive about BRIDGE-Wiz, incurred a great degree of agreement. So we felt that this is worth pushing, and now we have 9 organizations that are using or trialing BRIDGE-Wiz. So let's skip now to making those guidelines work, now that we've made guidelines that are potentially workable. Jeremy Grohl and Richard Grohl and Jeremy Grimshaw cataloged the interventions that have been used to try to influence clinician practice. Education through conferences and courses just doesn't seem to work very well at all. Audit and feedback, not so bad, right? Financial incentives, disincentives, that seems to work quite well sometimes. Patient-mediated interventions, giving the advice directly to patients, that also seems to be useful. And the one other technique that seems to make a difference is computer-based decision support. Clinical decision support, a definition. There are hundreds of them out there. I kind of like systems that link health observations, usually in an electronic health record, with health knowledge, experience, and expertise about what is true in order to influence health choices by clinicians for improved health care. Health got mentioned 2 or 3 or 4 times in that definition. There have been a number of systematic reviews of computer-based decision support. Most recently, there was one just a few months ago in Archives of Internal Medicine. They all seem to say the same thing. Computer-based decision support often, but not always, improves the process of care. And outcomes, which are infrequently measured, sometimes improve. And that's the best we can do. There are subgroup analyses that have attempted to tease out which are the most successful, and I'll suggest that you take a look particularly at Ken Kawamoto's paper from Duke in 2005. But this is somewhat of a crapshoot sometimes when we put up our decision support. We don't know whether it's going to improve processes, and the decision support is often so far divorced from the ultimate outcomes that it doesn't seem fair sometimes to measure those outcomes. There's a great challenge in representing guideline knowledge electronically, taking that textual narrative and turning it into computer-based decision support. And in fact, in many instances, it seems like it goes through a black box that maybe have different contents every time we use it. Nice study done back in 1998 by Vimla Patel looked at that black box. She got collaborators from Stanford, Harvard, and Columbia. Admittedly, she could have gone to better places. And gave them the task, they're knowledge engineers. She tasked them with encoding guidelines for immunization and for workup of a breast mass. The test that she asked them to perform was submitting standardized patients to these clinical decision support systems created by different groups and measured the outcome and found that different recommendations were given for the same patient at Columbia, Harvard, and Stanford. That's scary. It says that starting from the same spot and ending at three very different spots, we could really run into trouble in this decision support business. So we've attempted to look at the black box and to explode it, in fact, into a systematic approach to translation and transformation of knowledge that is both, again, systematic and replicable from one organization to another. Looking at the top box, the narrative guideline, it's not a grand idea for most organizations to go about creating narrative guidelines when there's no need for them. There needs to be a clinical objective, a clinical need, particularly for a healthcare delivery organization. We recognize that there is some value that could be ascribed to a guideline. We take that clinical objective and mix it with knowledge about appropriate care, which is derived from experience of experts and from systematic review of the literature that is carefully done and carefully weighed. We put that together and come up with a guideline narrative. Now that guideline narrative can and probably should be evaluated before you put a lot of effort into implementing it. And there are a number of tools for that. The AGREE collaboration can tell us something about a guideline's quality. The COGS checklist, the Conference on Guideline Standardization checklist, gives us other information about guideline quality. GLIA, something that we developed at Yale, the Guideline Implementability Appraisal, is helpful in looking at dimensions of implementation that are not covered by AGREE and COGS. And we're hoping that the Institute of Medicine's new standards can be turned into some form of measure that would be useful in terms of deciding whether this is a good guideline to take further down the path toward implementation. Now, the next step that we have found to be useful and others working with us have found to be useful is to apply a tool we call Gem Cutter to parse the guideline text into a standardized format, the guideline elements model, and build an XML file, a gem file. We got into this working, I guess now 12 or 13 years ago with the AAP, looking at some of their guideline recommendations and trying to parse them out and figure out where they went wrong. We were using colored highlighters at the time, trying to figure out what were the decision variables. In this case, if an infant or young child 2 months to 2 years of age with unexplained fever, sufficiently ill to warrant antimicrobial therapy, what's the action? A urine specimen should be obtained by suprapubic or bladder catheterization. Why? Because the diagnosis of a urine infection can't be established. The strength of evidence was good, but we rapidly ran out of highlighter colors. And there were many other aspects to these guidelines that we wanted to encode. Along about that time came XML, the extensible markup language, which allowed us to move from a finite and relatively small set of highlighter colors to an infinite set of colors. And we called that infinite set of colors, which now is about 167 different colors, the Guideline Elements Model. It's a knowledge model for guideline documents adopted as a standard in 2002, re-standardized in 2006, and again this year, that's intended to model the heterogeneous kinds of information contained in guidelines, both about recommendations and about how those recommendations came to be born. GEMcutter is the tool that we use to parse the guideline text. We call that gemifying. And again, that creates an XML file that can be manipulated. Those of you who are XML jockeys in the group know that there are lots of things that are good about XML. Number one, humans can still read it. And number two, machines know how to process it. GEMcutter takes the text of a guideline and allows you to select relevant chunks of that text and put it where it belongs in the Guideline Elements Model hierarchy. The next step, once we have the recommendations parsed, is to play with them a little and put them into a format that is going to be hopefully more useful and usable than the original narrative text. We use what we call extractor transforms, and again, these are available online for free, as is GEMcutter, on our website, which I'll show at the end. This is one view of the parsed guideline. I'm going to run over here for just a second. Got the recommendation title, the entire original text of the guideline before it got parsed, which allows you to look back and see if it was done correctly. The if statements, the then statements, the evidence quality, the strength of the recommendation, it's the term recommends in this case, and the text that suggests what the reasons were. And this is just one of multiple ways that you can manipulate the XML file to make it potentially more usable and useful. The next step is to take those terms, those concepts in the if-then statement, and to find those concepts in a controlled vocabulary. And this is not an easy task, right, Vivian? There are tools that are available for it. There are multiple controlled vocabularies that get used, but this is where we standardize on what those terms, or what we interpret those terms to really mean. And finally, perhaps the most important and most difficult set of steps is moving from those encoded if-then statements into what we call formal level, where you've got a functioning clinical decision support system. That requires that you analyze what is the local workflow and what's going to keep this from happening in this location. What are the barriers that may have been difficult to ascertain centrally when they put this guideline together, but that are very meaningful in this clinic at this time. And then we talk about origins and insertions, like for a muscle. When in the course of a clinical encounter, the origin, does all the information on the if side of that if-then rule become available? And when in the course of a clinical encounter does it seem reasonable to inject the information on the then side? There are lots of things that I think constitute clinical decision support. Many times people simplify this to only think about alerts and reminders, and those are certainly prominent and important kinds of decision support. But a documentation template that reminds you of assessments you should have made, I believe, represents decision support. Algorithms and flowcharts are decision support. Order entry facilitators represent decision support. Info buttons, calculators, and flow sheets that show you a particular patient's history and how things relate to one another, all of those help support the decisions that we clinicians make. So I want to show you how we incorporated some of those tools in a particular clinical decision support tool we built for asthma. We took EPR3, the NHLBI's most recent guideline. Now it's 5 years old already, almost time for a redo, to create decision support around chronic management for kids with asthma. And we found that a lot of the knowledge in that publication was contained in charts like this, in tables. And it became a challenge to figure out how to get the information out of tables and make it useful to a user. What we did was we modeled our input screens. We used centricity at Yale to look very much like the figures that the NHLBI helped to familiarize. And we included prompts for documentation. These are all assessments that ought to be made. How often do you have a cough due to asthma? How often do you wheeze? How often do you have shortness of breath, nighttime awakening? We have real-time calculation and display. As each of these buttons gets clicked, the impairment classification and the severity classification, risk classification are updated. We have on our next screen a summary of relevant past information, which isn't included here on this patient. We have prompts not just for collecting information, but a place where you record your assessment and why you think so. We have an alert. The computer judges at this time what the severity classification is and what the recommended therapy ought to be, but you're under no obligation to accept that. In fact, this stepwise system is also something that comes from the NHLBI guideline. And if, in this case, step 3 or 4 was recommended, but you could choose any one of these steps and have little information about what the pharmacologic and referral interventions recommended with each of those steps might be. So we call that information access. It's like pushing the info button. We have order sets for somebody with this kind of asthma, this severity, this risk, this this history of recent medications, which were collected on another screen. This is what's recommended, and all you have to do is click the button, and prescriptions will be created for you. We also put together a customizable handout with a medication authorization that they can take to daycare or school, and in hopes of getting our clinicians to use this decision support. So how did it work? Very high level. We implemented this decision support tool in 2 different settings at Yale, in our pediatric pulmonology clinic and in our pediatric primary care clinic. And it turns out that even though we had input from the pulmonologists all along, they didn't like it. They were not happy with it. It told them what to do. They were specialists, and they didn't like being told what to do. So as a result, they used it as a documentation tool, most often at the end of the day when the patient had left and the recommendations couldn't be followed. Primary care, completely different story. They didn't mind being told what to do. They sometimes disagreed, and they, in talking with the attendings in clinic, made their variations on the theme, but they didn't have problems with it. We didn't give up, and our next step was to try to get the pulmonologist to use it by interfering with the workflow that they had put together. As each patient registered, they got a little piece of paper with the patient's name and demographic information on it, and they recorded on those pieces of paper the answers to all the questions. How often is your kid wheezing? How often shortness of breath, et cetera, et cetera. And it was that piece of paper that they transcribed at the end of the day to write their notes. Well, instead, what we did was we developed an iPad application so that the patients answered all of those questions on the iPad, pushed a button, the information went wirelessly into Centricity, and in order to see it, in order to see the answers to all those questions, didn't have to ask them anymore, but in order to see it, they had to open up the decision support and see what was being recommended. And that has changed their use of the system from essentially 0 to more than 0, but not, not 100%. Interestingly, we did another study to see whether the pulmonologists really could benefit from using the decision support. And we involved some pulmonologists in reviewing the situations where there were conflicts between what the decision support recommended and what the physician actually did. About 90% of the time, they were in total agreement. The pulmonologist did just what the NHLBI thought was a great idea. However, in 5% of the cases, they were actually right. The decision support did not take into account extra factors that were important in the decision making. So it turns out that 5% of the time, they made the right decision and what was being offered by the decision support was wrong. However, that leaves 5%. And the pulmonologists agreed that in 5% of the cases, what was being recommended by NHLBI was more appropriate than what the pulmonologists were doing. Don't know what to do with those numbers. I've told the pulmonologists about it. They're still a tough bunch to crack. They are specialists. They spent a long time becoming specialists. Interestingly, we have nurse practitioners, experienced pulmonologists, and pulmonary fellows. And the pulmonary fellows are the ones who are more often in conflict. So there are multiple ways to influence practice, but computer-based decision support is a particularly effective one. When we say particularly effective, we're not talking about increasing adherence to recommended care to 90% or 80% necessarily. We're talking about increments in the 10 to 15% range being really quite good. It is important, though, to remember that if we're going to enforce guideline recommendations, we really ought to be basing them on high-quality knowledge. We need to make guidelines that work, that are clear, transparent, and more of us are looking at how we can facilitate the process and develop tools that will help to create better guidelines. Thanks very much for your attention. I'm happy to take questions.